Alex.
Hey, Antonella. How are you doing
We're,
today?
I'm doing well, thanks. We're back at it.
We are.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about chocolate and cholesterol and look at sort of a collection of studies that were looking at these things collectively, and then talk what we thought was helpful, how it fits into the greater sort of knowledge base around chocolate and cholesterol, because obviously this is an important question to daily life.
Yeah.
And then we'll sort of bring it all back home with a summary of how we take this information into like our actual real lives.
Yeah.
So if you want to walk us through this study, which was a meta-analysis, maybe we can talk through what a meta-analysis is in the first place and what we were looking for in it. Well,
Yeah.
not us, but the researchers.
Yes. So this one is called Effect of Cocoa Beverage and Dark Chocolate Intake on Lipid Profile in People Living with Normal and Elevated LDL Cholesterol, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And so the goal of this type of review and analysis isn't to do original research. So the researchers ask a question, and then they go out and they find studies that also ask that similar question. And then they collate all the information to see if like a summary gives a better conclusion, right? Because as we've talked about before, when we talk about research and when we're looking at research, it's not all about just one study. It's about the consensus of the research, right? I think we all know this, you can always find someone or something that is going to support an argument, no matter how outlandish that argument is. There's always something that's going to support it. But when you look at all of the evidence supporting that question, you look for a consensus, right? So there may be one or two outliers, but if 500 things say something different, we have to trust the 500 things over the two, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a particularly relevant question in today's landscape out there because, again, you can always find something to support your position, but if that position is a real outlier, that may not actually represent the whole truth or the truth of the situation.
Yeah.
So a meta-analysis does exactly that. It goes out, finds studies that all asked similar question as close to the same question as possible. And then there's specific statistical analyses that are meant for meta-analyses. And they smoosh all the information together and it spits out a conclusion. And this is particularly helpful because some questions and some studies only use and have only been able to use small population sizes, right? And so if you've got, as in this situation, studies that are 40 people, 50 people, 100 people, 120 people, that's quite different than if we had 100,000 people who are being studied, right? And so the value of a meta-analysis is we can take all of this, the different groups, and put them together and come up with a more conclusive answer. That's the goal of the meta-analysis.
Yes.
So that's what we're looking at today. And this question has been asked before, which is why they were able to do a meta-analysis in this situation.
Yeah. So the question they were asking, for them, it was almost like in three parts. So they wanted to figure out like how chocolate or cocoa beverage, so cocoa beverage, which was cocoa powder or dark chocolate, affected people who had normal LDL cholesterol levels or elevated cholesterol levels. They were also asking, and this is where it starts to get like a little bit more technical, is that like in that chocolate product, there's polyphenols or flavanols, which we've talked about in other episodes. And so they were trying to figure out like, was there a threshold? Like, was there a dose that you started to get benefit or harm on those lipids? Like, is there like this like minimum dose or maximum dose? Like, what is it about at the flavanol level and where that goes? And then they also wanted to see if there was a difference between how you delivered the chocolate. So if there was a difference between cocoa powder or a beverage or chocolate or them combined. And so those were the different things that they were looking at. Am I forgetting anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that's exactly right. And sometimes you read between the lines despite yourself. I think sometimes when we read these things, right? And my sense was they were expecting that their results, and this may not be true, right? But it seemed to me like they were expecting their results would meet the general consensus so far about chocolate and cholesterol, which is, I might as well jump into that if that's all right.
Yeah, I think that's smart.
Yeah, which is that taking in chocolate, and again, we're talking about cocoa powder dark chocolate, right? We're not talking about white chocolate or milk chocolate, where the things that we think make the difference, the polyphenol content, the flavanols, the catechins, so on, are diluted in those items or non-existent altogether, right? So when these studies are done with chocolate and cholesterol, they're typically done with those flavanol-rich pieces, which are dark chocolate or cocoa powder. So the general consensus is that the intake of those things modestly, and I really emphasize the modestly, decreases LDL cholesterol, and so modestly as to be questionably clinically relevant, right? And so we've talked about before, we always have to be really cautious as practitioners looking at research and trying to derive conclusions, but with the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance, right? So just because something has been shown to be a real difference doesn't mean that in our day-to-day practice it's all that useful, right? And so if your cholesterol in that consensus, for example, we think that chocolate, flavonoid-rich chocolate can reduce cholesterol, LDL cholesterol by, let's say, 5 to 6 milligrams per deciliter, or a very small millimole per liter quantity, 0.05 or something along those lines. That's nice that it can do that, but does that really make a difference to our bottom line of cardiovascular risk? Not really, right? And
Yeah.
so that's sort of the general consensus about chocolate. And so I got the sense that these researchers were thinking along the same lines, which is why they also wanted to see if they could discern, is there a threshold of flavonoid content, right? Because that could be really practical. It's like,
Yes.
yes, we know it's a modest improvement, but we also know that you need this much to do
Hmm.
it, right? And so
Yes.
if you're adding chocolate to your diet, and I'm like getting ahead of ourselves here, but if you're adding chocolate to your diet in part as an effort to support your cholesterol, this is what that should look like. I mean, that would at the very least be a practical takeaway.
Yes, totally. Okay, yeah, so we know we're sort of like walking into this study with the understanding that chocolate can moderately decrease, not in any clinical, meaningful way. Like, no one's ever or should not ever be like, I think you should eat chocolate to lower your cholesterol. I mean, we wish this were the world we live in, but unfortunately it's not. So that's what we walked in with. And what they found in this study is that so they looked at total cholesterol. So they had two groups, right? They had people with normal cholesterol and elevated cholesterol. And then they looked at what happened based on the cocoa beverage or the chocolate. And they looked at different parameters of their lipid panel. So they looked at their total cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol, as well as their triglycerides. And so I'm going to just lump all of those together. There was literally nothing to see there. So it made no effect on either of the groups. If you had normal cholesterol or lower or elevated cholesterol and all of those parameters, nothing really
Change.
happened. It didn't matter if you had the cocoa beverage or the chocolate or both, all sort of the same. Where there was a little bit of difference was on the HDL. And so it was significant for people with normal LDL. So if they started with normal LDL cholesterol, your HDL went up slightly. And then the same thing happened for people with elevated LDL, but it was just barely. Like that one was just like barely achieved significance at that point. And then finally, if we did actually organize by the food matrix, so I might actually need to caveat what I had said earlier, there was a little bit of a difference. So when we looked at the cocoa beverage, that one seemed to be slightly better for HDL. Yeah, but that was the only one. That was the only one where we saw a difference. And then the polyphenol and flavanol content, we really didn't get a threshold or a certain dose or anything that we saw. So there wasn't a lot to see.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sometimes with studies you go in going, yeah, it's gonna blow our socks off, or at least if it meets the consensus, right? Because sometimes that's what research is doing.
Yeah.
It's just building on what came before and strengthening the argument or discounting the argument, but like we're just building on what came before.
Yeah.
And in this case, like I said before, we might have been hoping for something maybe a little more practical coming out of this. Like this is the amount that you're looking for to make that modest change that may or may not be useful.
Hmm. Hmm.
But we didn't even get there because it was like actually the LDL cholesterol was not influenced in the least, not for
Yeah.
better, not for worse. And the HDL cholesterol change was again modest at best, right? And
Yeah.
so I think one of the numbers that was discussed was like a 0.05 millimole per liter. And off the top of my head, I don't know what that is milligrams per deciliter.
I
I'm
don't either.
sorry. but it's modest. That I can
Yes,
tell you,
very modest,
right?
very modest.
Yeah. And so there are lots of other things from a lifestyle nutrition perspective that would have potentially a much greater influence. And so again, we're back to that idea, like I'm not recommending chocolate anytime soon to increase people's HDL cholesterol. Right. And so it was, I think we went into all of this going, yeah, we're gonna just have more to say.
Yeah, but it was like we have sort of, let's say the bulk of evidence that we walked in was like there was a very, very moderate decrease, and then we have the study that says like nothing really changes, like there's not a lot of effect. And maybe on the surface those can seem contrary, but I think they aren't, right? Like there's just like I think it's clear that the chocolate doesn't appear harmful, right? And that's another way of looking at this. Like
Yeah.
there isn't harm. We've had discussions around polyphenols and flavanols, and so they are a potential flavanol source in the diet. It doesn't appear to be harmful, um, but it still leaves us with the question around saturated fat, which was for me and for us, I think one of our biggest criticisms was that like we didn't really know in practical terms what these serving sizes were. We didn't know the saturated fat content all the time of the chocolate they were eating or the consumption in the diet because once we get away from cocoa powder into dark chocolate or flavonoid-rich chocolate, we do have the addition of saturated fat. So we did a little bit of digging on the chocolate that I personally eat, and we figured out that it actually, like, if we had half a bar, it had 9 or 10 grams of saturated fat, which,
Yeah.
Alex, if you wanna put that in
Yeah.
context of saturated
I would be
fat,
pleased to.
you wanna burst that bubble real
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, because this is something I talk about focusing on cardiovascular health in my practice and talking about cholesterol a lot. We talk about saturated fat a lot
Mhm.
because there is a correlation between saturated fat intake and cholesterol levels, specifically LDL cholesterol levels. Like so many things, there's genetic influences and what we call inter-individual variability. So some people are going to be more influenced by this, or their LDL cholesterol will be more influenced by this than others. But collectively as a people, the higher our saturated fat content, the more likely it will translate to increases in our LDL cholesterol. And we believe there's a bit of a threshold to that. And it's in and around 10% of our total daily calories. So put a different way, it's if the amount of saturated fat that you take in your diet like makes up 10% of the calories you have in that day or more, there's a good chance that it's going to increase your LDL cholesterol. So when we talk about dietary approaches to reducing LDL cholesterol, we talk about reducing saturated fat intake, but really the nuance there is we're trying to get it below, feel comfortable that we're getting it below this 10% threshold. So the example I give to make this a little bit more tangible instead of this like
Yeah, like, what's 10% of my
intangible. Yeah,
calories? Yeah, I
right.
have no idea.
Yeah. So the example I'll give is, if an average person needs 2,000 calories to like maintain their weight, like that's not an outlandish number. That's a pretty standard number.
Mhm.
10% of that total daily caloric need would be 200 calories. And we know that fat, like a gram of fat, regardless of the type of fat it is, saturated fat or otherwise, but in this case, of course, we're talking about saturated fat.
Mm.
A gram of fat is actually 9 calories per gram. But in my example, to make it easier to understand for me, mostly, I pretend that a gram of fat gives us 10 calories. And so if I say, okay, so if someone needs 2,000 calories a day for maintenance, 10% of that is 200 calories. And if we know that fat is 10 grams per, or 10 calories per gram, which is not true, it is not. But if it's 10 calories per gram, then in our 200 calories, 20 grams would represent 10% of our total daily calories in this example. The actual number, because it is 9 calories and not 10 calories, is like around 22.
Yeah.
But it's like a quick way to spitball, like, where your 10% threshold is if you have a general sense of what your total daily calories are, and there's calculators for that, and so on and so forth. But if we use this example and back to Antonella's chocolate bar, so if half a bar of chocolate is providing, let's say, 9 grams of saturated fat, and in our example, if Antonella needed 2,000 calories for her day-to-day needs, that chocolate bar, half chocolate bar, would already be providing almost like 50% of that 10%,
Yeah.
like half of her
Yeah.
10% threshold of saturated fat, whereby if she went above that, she would start to see an negative influence on her LDL cholesterol. Now, if her LDL cholesterol isn't elevated, that may or may not make a difference, right? But if it's elevated, then of course we're being especially more mindful of that. So if someone, and there's nothing wrong with having a half a bar of chocolate a day, potentially, right?
It does
But
have the gut saturated
if,
fat in other
well, that's the
places if
thing,
LDL
right?
is of concern. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're less clear about that piece because the additional nuance, of course, is that the types of saturated fats in chocolate, like the proportions of, because there's more than one kind of saturated fat, the types in chocolate are different proportionately speaking than that in animal fat, which we're really clear about causes a problem with that 10% threshold. And so we can't be 100% sure that and we don't believe that the saturated fat in chocolate acts exactly like the saturated fat in animal products, but we don't know that well enough. And I think we're all very suspicious that if you pushed it past that 10% using chocolate saturated fat, you would
Yes.
probably still end up in trouble, right? Like that's not, and by trouble, I just mean seeing that increase in your
Yeah.
LDL cholesterol, which translates to increased risk of cardiovascular disease over the long term. So, really long, complicated story short, it's that chocolate bars, like chocolate, rather than
Yeah.
cocoa powder, which has no fat included, no saturated fat, it is a different conversation. So that's why the study looked at separating those two pieces. Now, in that case, it didn't see any change, but because we don't know what the like serving sizes were,
Mm.
we can't say that any of those studies that the meta-analysis is made of includes portion sizes that might have tipped someone over their 10% threshold. So if they were all under 10%, then we're kind of comparing apples to apples and we're like, okay, doesn't really influence anything. But if there's variability and we don't know, or if it's over the 10%, that would be good to know because then they're like, oh, well, it didn't increase the LDL cholesterol. And if those people were over their 10% threshold, that would be excellent to know because then we would have more evidence of maybe the saturated fat in chocolate doesn't play by the same rules exactly as the saturated fat in animal products. Hopefully that made sense. Did that make sense as a through
I
line?
think, yeah,
Yeah.
I think it totally makes sense. Yeah. So I think we know to like bring it all home really is that because we didn't have dosing, we didn't have saturated fat, right? This study isn't like landmark, like it isn't moving the needle a whole lot, but it's telling us there isn't harm. We would not add chocolate to our diet in an effort to lower cholesterol,
Right.
but chocolate could be part of a healthy diet. We still want to be cautious in terms of saturated fat because there might be an area where the chocolate is putting us over those 10% of calories from the daily diet, and that could be potentially harmful to LDL. But if we stay sort of on this side of that 10%, we have no reason to believe it's harmful. And we may come to learn that that saturated fat is different, which would be like amazing news and super interesting. And there's lots of like food chemistry in the food matrix, which is not the first time we've mentioned. But TBD, we
Yeah.
still don't know, to be determined on that
Yeah.
part.
Yeah.
And then if you're ultra worried or it's something that you're concerned about in saturated fat, is maybe you would opt for cocoa powder over the actual chocolate, right? Or maybe you have a little bit of chocolate and you can be a little bit more liberal with the cocoa powder to sort of meet both of those needs. And it's a good polyphenol flavanol source, which we'll link to the episode we did on that. Look at
Indeed.
us
That's a
link
good
into other
idea.
videos.
I love it. Yeah, and I think that's a perfect sort of conclusion or summary of our takeaway there, which
Hmm.
is, yeah, that. I would put my 2 cents example takeaway in there. So I like chocolate.
Yes.
I like chocolate, but I'm not one of those people who likes like chocolate flavored everything, right? But I came
Hmm.
across this recipe for like a snack or a breakfast thing. It was meant to be like higher fiber and whatnot. It's like you you make like a little mini granola and you put it on the bottom of a muffin tin. And then you make a yogurt thing. So it's like you whip yogurt with a bit of peanut butter and cocoa powder, which was my whole
Oh.
point.
Hmm.
A little bit of
Hmm.
honey or some sort of sweetener of your choice, right? And then sort of this kind of a thick blend, and then you put it on top of this like granola fiber, like there's psyllium in chia and oats and whatnot. And you
Yeah.
just freeze it, right? And so
Nice.
it comes into like a little muffin shaped yogurt, frozen yogurt topped thing with
Mhm.
a higher fiber bottom. Anyway, you have to let it thaw before you eat it. It is not, you can't eat it frozen. It's like you have to let it thaw for 45 minutes. But I was like, oh, this is quite delicious and filling. And it has the cocoa powder, right? So we're back to this idea of,
Mm.
I originally thought of it just as a flavor, right? Like, oh, it's kind of a nice
Yeah.
chocolate flavored thing, a nice way we can integrate without being too, again, like granular or like mental
Yeah.
real estate-y about it, right? You just go,
Mhm.
oh, isn't that nice? I added some extra flavanols to the mix
Yeah.
because I'm, trying to be aware of polyphenols based on the growing research in the study we looked at, the variety of
Mhm.
polyphenols being queen. So this was a nice way to introduce that, and I didn't have to worry about the saturated fat. Is a long story short.
Yeah, and we also realized that just made me think that cocoa powder also has fiber in it, like, right? Like, we
Right,
never really associate that and, maybe at 1 or 2 tablespoons, it might be, like, 1 or 2 grams, but at 100 grams, it has 37. So I guess per gram, it would be I'm not gonna do that math
right,
live, but, you know how to do the math there.
right.
100 grams had 37 grams of fiber that even in, like, a little bit of tablespoon, you're adding just a little bit of fiber, so that we know is good.
Yeah.
So, yeah, gives us I think what I'm taking home now that we're talking into it a little bit more is also, right, like knowing the principles, how it applies, I think just makes you more empowered to make the choices without it having to take a lot of real estate,
Right.
right? Like the rules are actually a little bit looser and then we know like where we can be flexible, maybe where we need to be a little bit tighter, but it just gives us that I think like a better roadmap to help navigate those things.
Especially because I think things like chocolate, the conversation around chocolate, just like the conversation around coffee, often defaults to a negative position,
Yeah.
right? It's like drinking coffee is bad for you. And I mean, I've been in practice 25 years. I remember a time where I might have suggested that very
Mhm.
thing, right?
Mhm.
Which grows and so does our practice, right? And so,
Yeah.
but today, very commonly, I will see people default to like, ooh, I have like a craving for chocolate. It's a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are very few bad things. It's all about how it fits in, right? And I think
Mhm.
to your point, this is a great exploration. These studies are a great exploration of how can we take a little bit of information and just make things fit better for us and
Yeah.
like maintain some joy in life and in our food.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. All right, that's an excellent note. As always, it was so good to see you,
You too,
Alex, and
Antonella.
hope y'all enjoyed this.